Podcast, where truth moves faster than a Holstein calf. No waiting on some pretty page. We're charting new ground in the digital age. From genomic codes to roll-out facts, we cut through the noise, no holding back. Not your daddy's dairy news tonight. We're sparking debates with every insight. The ring's not where the real fight's at. It's in the data, in the channel chat. From pasture to processor to your morning cup, we're raising the stakes. Try and get ahead of herd. Yeah! Where the future's more than just a word. Ahead of herd. Come on! The Bullvine's calling, let your voice be heard.
Welcome back to the Bullvine Podcast, where we cut through dairy industry noise to get you the operational insights that actually matter for your operation.
And today, we're doing a deep dive into a feature piece that, honestly, should be mandatory reading for every producer, manager, lender, everyone in the country, really.
Which one is this?
It's Dairy's 8-hour breaking point, labor, biology, and economics. And this one, well, it has layers. It's definitely going to challenge some core assumptions, particularly around how much buffer, or maybe how little buffer, we truly have in our current production model.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately then. Why this topic right now? I mean, we saw those very public enforcement actions up in Vermont recently, didn't we?
Exactly. That really brought this vulnerability right out into the open. It forced producers to confront a crisis scenario that, maybe they always hoped was just theoretical.
Right. We're not talking about slow policy shifts anymore. This is immediate. This is like catastrophic operational risk staring you in the face.
And that's why this is so critical. This isn't just abstract politics or some long-term economic trend we can ignore for now. The stakes here are profoundly, almost terrifyingly biological.
Biological? How so?
Well, if the current labor structure gets, abruptly destabilized, someone leaves, someone's removed, the risk is immediate. It's your cow herd, it's udder health, and ultimately it's the viability of your entire operation, measurable within a single shift.
Wow. Okay. And the feature piece makes it clear this isn't just hypothetical risk. It's actually modeled out, isn't it? They talk about potential cascading failures.
They do, across the entire food system.
And, okay, let's just put the controversy out there right away. We're going to get into these Texas A&M economic models that project, well, a pretty catastrophic price increase for milk if the labor structure fails.
Yeah, the numbers are pretty staggering.
We're talking about pushing a gallon of milk, maybe around $4 now, up to what, $7.60?
$7.60.
Yeah.
That's not just a price fluctuation. As you said, that's a full-on food system shock.
That number alone, $7.60, should make everyone sit up and pay attention, shouldn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It just highlights that the fundamentals of the entire U.S. dairy supply are tied directly to this often unstable, often ignored labor system, a system that's just incredibly vulnerable to external shocks.
Okay, so let's start with that central idea, the 8-hour breaking point. This is where biology basically dictates the terms to the politics and economics of dairy farming.
Right. The article hammers this home. This breaking point is that incredibly narrow window between losing labor, say, essential staff, leaving or being removed, and finding yourself in a herd-wide biological crisis.
And it's the speed that's terrifying, you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. As producers, we schedule everything day to day, but have we really modeled what happens if there's a catastrophic disruption? Like, really modeled it?
Probably not in this detail.
The source uses that horrifyingly clear Vermont anecdote. 8 essential workers arrested on their day off. And suddenly the farm is in a genuine animal welfare and financial crisis within hours.
So that farm had less than 1 work shift of buffer. Less than 8 hours.
8 hours. That's maybe all the buffer you get before things truly start to unravel.
Yeah.
Because you have to maintain that rhythm, that biological rhythm.
What is the specific biological crisis then? What drives this incredibly narrow timeline?
It's simple, really. It's the immediate, absolutely non-negotiable need for milking every 12 hours. Period. End of story.
Cows are biological factories.
Exactly. Operating on a strict schedule. If you delay milking significantly past that 12-hour mark, you immediately start pushing the internal pressure within the udder.
Okay.
That pressure stresses the cow, it stresses the tissue, and boom, you've created the ideal breeding ground for bacteria. Mastitis loves that environment.
So push past 18 hours, you're in severe distress territory. but hit 24 hours without proper milking, which, is entirely possible if a farm loses multiple shifts of trained labor all at once.
Then you are facing the potential for a full-scale, herd-wide mastitis outbreak. It's almost inevitable at that point.
There was that quote from the Wisconsin producer.
Yeah, perfectly put. Cows don't care about your immigration stance. They need milking every 12 hours, period.
Yeah.
That's just the hard biological truth of it.
And we're not just talking about a few uncomfortable cows here, are we? A herd-wide mastitis outbreak. That's a systemic failure.
Oh, it can cripple an operation. For years, the source details the financial fallout. Treatment costs for a severe case antibiotics, vet time, that milk withdrawal period, can actually cost more than replacing the cow itself.
Wait. Treatment costing more than the cow? That's basically a culling decision then, not really a financial choice anymore.
It often is. And the production losses don't just stop that day, right? They compound. They affect future lactations. So suddenly, some political decision made hundreds of miles away forces a producer into making massive, unwanted culling decisions right there on the farm.
That's brutal.
It is. But here's something fascinating, and the source highlights this so well. The loss isn't just warm bodies in the parlor. When that Vermont farm lost those 8 workers, they didn't just lose labor hours. They lost years, maybe decades, of accumulated institutional knowledge.
Whoa, okay.
Like, think about it. They lost the workers who knew instinctively which cows were prone to kicking, who were really skilled at handling those vulnerable fresh cows gently, who could spot the very early signs of mastitis, maybe even before it showed up on a CMT paddle.
Right. That deep, specialized knowledge of individual animals, that's irreplaceable in the short term. You absolutely cannot just hire someone off the street and expect them to handle fresh cow protocols or spot subclinical mastitis.
Exactly. You lose expertise that is utterly critical to animal welfare and, frankly, your profit margins.
So the whole farm, this living, breathing biological system, becomes incredibly vulnerable almost instantly.
Precisely. And the implication is clear. This vulnerability is disproportionately high for those larger-scale operations managing living systems on these constant 12-hour schedules, 365 days a year.
That Marathon County producer, quote, really nailed it, didn't it?
It did. Our operation demands constant attention because we're managing living systems, not manufacturing widgets. You can pause the widget line. You can't pause gestation or lactation.
And that is the core difference, isn't it? We talk about automation, efficiency, but dairy is fundamentally different from a factory.
Totally different. If the assembly line shuts down, okay, you lose a shift's production. Annoying, but manageable. If a dairy parlor shuts down for 24 hours, you risk losing your herd's health and productivity for months, maybe even years. Biology truly doesn't pause for politics or paperwork.
Okay, so moving past that immediate biological crisis, let's tackle the elephant in the room. The question that always comes up, especially from outside the industry. Why can't domestic workers just fill these jobs?
Yes, the just hire Americans argument.
We really have to challenge that assumption head on because the data, particularly from the North Carolina Growers Association, paints a really, really clear picture of the reality on the ground. It's pretty brutal.
Yeah, this data needs to be shouted from the rooftops. Because it just stops that conversation dead when people claim American workers just need higher wages or better benefits. The problem is clearly structural. It's not purely economic.
So let's dive into that NC data. North Carolina advertised 6,500 farm positions, needed jobs, available jobs, in a state that had, nearly 500,000 unemployed residents nearby?
Yep, 500,000 unemployed. By any conventional economic logic, that should have resulted in a flood of applicants, right?
You'd think so. But it didn't. They documented only 268 people even applied.
268 out of 500,000. That's, what is that percentage-wise? Tiny. 0.05%. That tells you immediately the interest just isn't there, almost regardless of the pay being offered.
And the retention numbers are even more staggering. They hired 245 of those applicants.
But only 163 actually showed up for the first day. Big drop-off already.
Huge. And then, even worse, by the end of the agricultural season, how many were left?
7. Just 7 workers remained. Out of the thousands of unemployed folks nearby who could have theoretically taken those jobs, 7.
That's an attrition rate of, over 95%? It's unbelievable.
Now, contrast that with the other side. The documented Mexican workers who started that same season, 90% of them completed the entire work contract, verified in compliance reports.
90% completion versus maybe 3 or 4% retention for the domestic hires?
The retention rate is more than 10 times higher for the foreign workers. That kind of disparity isn't just random chance. It points to something fundamental.
So what does this mean for the producer listening right now? The one who keeps hearing politicians say, just hire locally, translate this data for them.
Okay, well, in plain English for the farmer listening.
Yeah.
Here's what the policy analysts and, frankly, people in cities are not telling the public. It's not just about the paycheck. Cornell's Ag Workforce Development Program, they've done a ton of studies on this.
And what did they find?
They found compensation levels were often competitive, compared to other local unskilled labor jobs. But the major sticking points are the unique requirements of dairy work. It's the lifestyle.
You mean the quality of life factors?
Exactly. It's that combination. It's the pre-dawn starts you can't exactly sleep in when the cows need milking at 4 a.m. It's the intense, physically demanding labor day in, day out.
And the location.
Yeah, the almost inevitable geographic isolation of most large dairies. They're not usually right next door to town. And then, let's be blunt, there's the persistent societal perception of agricultural work as somehow less desirable. Low status.
So it requires a lifestyle commitment that most domestic workers, even if they need a job, just aren't willing to make long term.
That seems to be the core issue. They're not willing to make that commitment for the long haul.
Yeah.
It's not just a job. It's a 24/7, 365 reality.
But hang on, is it really just lifestyle? Or is the industry maybe still structurally dependent on paying wages that, okay, might be competitive with unskilled local labor, but maybe domestic workers just find insulting for the sheer difficulty and that 247 commitment required? Is there a wage component too?
It's probably a bit of both, but the evidence really leans heavily towards the lifestyle being the primary driver. Because even when operations do offer genuinely competitive wages, they still face this retention problem.
Right. Like that anonymous Vermont producer quote.
Yeah, that reinforces the anecdotal reality perfectly. 20 years, 2 American applicants, over 100 immigrant applicants. Both Americans were gone within 2 weeks.
Wow. 20 years, 2 applicants.
The jobs were there. The pay was presumably adequate for the local market. But that 24/7, 365 lifestyle requirement, that seems to be the absolute unmovable stumbling block for domestic workforce retention in dairy.
So the data really suggests that without the immigrant workforce, those jobs simply go unfilled. Production literally stops.
That's what the numbers point to. It's not a preference. It's become a structural necessity.
And that structural reality, that necessity, brings us directly to the money. We need to quantify the cost of this vulnerability, not just for the individual farm, but for the entire food system.
Yeah, this is where it gets really serious on a macro level.
Let's transition to those high-level economic models from the Texas A&M Agricultural and Food Policy Center. This is where we can really break down what a labor crisis truly costs the American food system, right?
Right, and this is the cold, hard math that, frankly, should be driving every policy discussion around ag labor. Texas A&M looked at almost 2,850 dairy operations across 14 key states. They modeled the impact using established supply and demand elasticity principles.
Elasticity meaning how much demand changes when price changes?
Exactly, and their projections, even in the, let's say, less extreme scenarios, are frankly terrifying for the industry and consumers.
Okay, let's start with the extreme scenario they modeled. First, a complete and sudden loss of immigrant labor. Maximum fragility scenario. What happens?
Their models project the national herd would immediately lose 2.1 million cows.
2.1 million cows. We need some perspective on that. What's that equivalent to?
That's like taking the entire dairy cow populations of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania combined and just wiping them off the map overnight.
Gone. Okay, and the milk production?
The resulting supply drop is massive and immediate. 48.4 billion pounds of annual production lost. That removes nearly a quarter, 25% of the current U.S. milk supply from the market. Just vanishes.
And farms.
In that scenario, the study projects the closure of 7,000 farms. Permanently. Those operations simply cannot recover from that kind of inventory loss and cash flow hit. They're done.
So here's where it hits the consumer and the wider economy. Based on those elasticity models you mentioned.
Yeah, how consumers react to price.
Retail milk prices would jump 90%. Is that right? 90%.
90%. Pushing that average $4 gallon up to that staggering $7.60 figure we mentioned earlier.
I mean, that $7.60 number, it just sounds fictional, doesn't it? But you're saying the model supports it based on that supply shock.
We have to remember the deep dependency they modeled. When you suddenly remove 25% of the supply of a relatively inelastic product like fluid milk, meaning people still need to buy it even if the price goes up a bit, the market response is brutal and quick. That massive price hike is actually what stabilizes the market, but at a much lower volume.
But what does $7.60 really mean in the real world? Would every grocery store just instantly jack the price up that high? Or would we see, like, emergency government intervention, price controls?
Well, you'd likely see immediate short-term chaos in the market. Panic buying, maybe.
Yeah.
Followed by almost certainly desperate government intervention, especially around nutritional programs like WIC and school lunches. But initially, the consumer gets hit hardest. The government can't just magically produce milk, right? That price reflects the true cost of sudden severe scarcity.
Okay, that's the extreme case. What about the less extreme, but maybe more plausible scenario, like losing half the immigrant workforce maybe through piecemeal state-by-state enforcement actions?
Which feels like a much more possible near-term reality, unfortunately.
So what happens then?
We're still looking at a massive production decrease, about 24 billion pounds less milk annually.
And the price impact?
It still translates to roughly a 45% price increase for milk at retail. So suddenly milk is, what, $5.80 or $6 a gallon? Still a huge jump.
And that 45% hit, it concentrates where it hurts the most, right? The National Milk Producers Federation found something about this.
Yeah, NMPF found that these essential immigrant workers tend to concentrate in the most productive, highest efficiency operations. Those mega-dairies we're going to talk more about.
So wait, when the labor disappears, you don't just lose the output of, say, a small struggling farm. You lose the concentrated output of the industry's powerhouses.
Exactly. It becomes an efficiency problem that gets compounded instantly, which guarantees that the resulting price hike is immediate and severe for everyone.
And the ripple effects just keep spreading outward.
Oh, absolutely. The USDA research suggests that if milk prices jump that high, even the 45% increase overall demand would probably drop 15-20%. Low-income families, people on fixed incomes, they get hit the hardest, obviously.
And that demand doesn't just, like, evaporate, right? People still need calories.
No, you'd see massive shifts, probably not driven by preference, but by price, towards cheaper plant-based alternatives. People switching to almond or oat milk, not because they suddenly prefer the taste, but because it's the only thing they can afford in that price range.
And that's just fluid milk. What about everything else dairy goes into?
Right. Think about cheese prices maybe doubling. That completely changes the economics of the pizza industry. Casual dining, frozen meals, butter at maybe $8 a pound. That fundamentally changes costs for bakeries, food manufacturers.
School lunch programs.
Oh, school lunch programs would need massive, multi-billion-dollar emergency funding increases from the federal government just to keep providing basic nutritional requirements. It's truly a full-scale food system shock, and it's tied directly back to this single point of failure, our vulnerable farm labor system.
Okay, so when we talk about solutions to this really fundamental labor vulnerability, the conversation almost always turns to technology, right? Automation, robotics.
The silver bullet argument, yeah.
And we have to acknowledge, the global milking robot market is booming. The projections are huge, jumping from around $2.3 billion now to maybe $4 billion, maybe even $7 billion by 2030. That sounds like the obvious fix, doesn't it?
It sounds like the perfect solution, especially in the press release or the sales pitch. But here's the critical reality check we're hearing from the farmers, the early adopters, actually using this stuff on the ground.
Okay, what's the reality?
University of Wisconsin research, pretty solid stuff, shows these automated systems do reduce labor time per cow significantly, by about 38% to 43%.
That's not insignificant. That's a real efficiency gain.
Absolutely. It's meaningful. But it still leaves over 60% of the total labor needs on the dairy completely unaddressed.
60%? Like what?
Like all the dry cow care, the critical fresh cow management, getting them started right, the breeding decisions, the feeding programs and management. Robots don't do any of that.
So robots are fantastic tools maybe for the parlor itself, for the milking process.
Yeah, for that specific task.
But they are absolutely not a total labor replacement solution for the whole farm. And the costs involved in just making that partial switch, they sound huge, both in capital and operational know-how.
Oh, completely. That Wisconsin case study they mentioned really highlights the financial complexity. The owner of that Appleton operation, he noted they called tech support daily for the first month just to keep the system running smoothly. Daily calls.
Wow.
And crucially, they didn't eliminate labor costs. They mostly just shifted them. They went from paying general parlor workers maybe $16, $17 an hour to needing highly specialized technicians, people often requiring degrees or advanced certifications, at $24 to $26 an hour. That's a massive jump in the type of labor needed, and the cost per hour, even if the total hours are reduced somewhat.
And the upfront capital investment. That must raise huge questions about viability. especially for mid-sized farms. What kind of numbers are we actually looking at for installation?
Well, current estimates for just a 200-cow operation, you're looking at somewhere between $500,000 and $750,000 for a quality multi-unit system. $500,000 to $750,000.
For 200 cows. And the payback.
Michigan State Extension crunched the numbers.
Yeah.
They estimate the payback period for that kind of investment is somewhere between 7 and 10 years. And that's assuming stable milk prices.
Assuming stable milk prices, but Sarah, we just talked about price volatility. Class 3 milk has been bouncing like crazy, between $16 and $20 per hundredweight just this year alone.
Exactly. Assuming stability for a 7 to 10-year ROI, that's a giant, pretty risky financial leap of faith for many farms, isn't it?
It makes the transition potentially devastating financially if something goes wrong, or if milk prices tank right after you install. Wait, did you catch that part in the article about the Kansas retrofitting mistake? This seems like a key example of how trying to cut corners with this tech can backfire spectacular.
Oh yeah, that was painful to read. The owner tried to save on the initial construction costs by adapting an existing older tie stall barn layout for their new robotic system. Bad idea.
Why? What happened?
It created terrible cow traffic flow. The layout just wasn't designed for voluntary movement. Cows were confused by narrow paths, awkward turns. It just didn't work. And they realized that mistake was costing them 10 pounds of milk per cow per day until they finally bit the bullet and completely redesigned the barn layout properly.
10 pounds a day per cow. If you have, say, 150 cows, that's 1,500 pounds of milk just gone every single day.
The source calculated that mistake cost the operation something like $150,000 in lost revenue. They'll never get back. Just during the period before the redesign was finished. It shows the immense risk and the precision needed. You can't just bolt these things in anywhere.
No kidding. And we have to be realistic about the limitations of the robots themselves, too. There are critical tasks they just cannot do, things that require actual judgment.
Right. They still can't manage that, 10 to 20% of cows that simply never figure out voluntary traffic flow, those fetch cows. They still need to be brought into the robot manually, twice a day, every day.
So you still need labor for that.
Yep. They also can't handle the careful, patient, fresh cow training needed to get heifers adapted. They can't make critical breeding decisions based on visual cues or health records. And they certainly can't manage complex treatment protocols that require genuine on-farm judgment from an experienced human herdsperson.
Let's focus on that 10-20% of non-adapting cows for a sec. What does a farmer actually do with those animals on a robotic farm? That's still a huge drain on labor time, isn't it? Fetching 20% of your herd twice a day.
It is a massive drain. You basically have two choices. Neither is great. Either you dedicate that highly paid labor, that $24 an hour tech to fetching, and sometimes forcing those cows into the robot every single shift.
Which kills your labor savings.
Exactly. Or the other option is you simply call those otherwise healthy cows earlier than you normally would, just because they don't fit the system. Both choices reduce your overall efficiency and definitely raise your hidden costs.
And remember, the entire heifer raising program, the dry cow management, that all remains completely manual anyway.
It's completely manual. So, bottom line, automation helps with milking efficiency, yes, but it is absolutely not solving the fundamental labor dependency problem completely, not by a long shot.
Okay, so this inherent labor vulnerability, combined with the really high capital cost of adopting new technology like robots, it feels like it's just pouring gasoline on a fire we've been watching for years. Consolidation.
Yeah, it's accelerating it, no question.
The USDA census data they cited, comparing 2017 to 2022, it's absolutely brutal. We lost, nearly 16,000 dairy farms? 15,866 farms gone.
In just 5 years.
Yet national milk production actually increased by 5% during that same period. That is just the definition of ruthless efficiency at work, isn't it?
The math is just unforgiving, and it really dictates the future shape of the industry. Look at the breakdown by size. Farms under 100 cows, down 42%.
Wow.
Operations with 100 to 499 cows, they dropped 34%. Significant losses in the middle, too.
Meanwhile,
the mega-dairies, those defined as over 2,500 cows, their numbers are up 17%.
Up 17%. And what does this mean in terms of actual milk production?
It means that the 834 largest dairy operations in the country now generate 46%, almost half of all U.S. milk production. Less than 1,000 farms producing nearly half the milk.
And the reason for this relentless consolidation, it's structural, isn't it? And probably insurmountable for many smaller operations. USDA research confirmed that cost gap.
Yeah, the production cost difference. Smaller operations, on average, incur production costs roughly $10 per hundredweight higher than their larger competitors. $10 a hundredweight.
Walk us through why that cost gap is so consistently huge. What drives it?
Well, it's a combination of factors. Infrastructure costs spread over more units. Specialization of labor, a mega-dairy can afford full-time nutritionists, specialized vets, dedicated hoof trimmers, and amortize that cost across thousands of cows.
Economies of scale in purchasing.
Immense purchasing power for feed, fuel, supplies, everything. They can invest millions in advanced waste management systems or robotics and actually achieve a faster, more stable return on investment than a smaller farm that's just struggling to meet payroll and basic compliance.
So when margins get thin, like they often do in dairy,
that $10 centered at cost difference is the absolute death knell for smaller operations trying to compete on the commodity market. There's just no way to bridge that gap long term.
And what's really fascinating, or maybe sobering, is that this trend isn't unique to the U.S., right? It's not just our specific regulations or market structure causing this.
No, the source points out clear global parallels. Look at Canada's supply management system, completely different structure. Yet their average herd size grew from 85 to 98 cows in that same 5-year period. Still consolidating.
In the Netherlands?
The Netherlands, with totally different regulations, intense land constraints. They lost 30% of their dairy farms in just a decade.
So that suggests this pressure for operational efficiency, for scale. It's just an unstoppable global force, regardless of the political system or market rules.
It really seems that way. If you're not constantly growing and improving efficiency, you're essentially being slowly, inexorably squeezed out of the commodity market.
Okay, so based on all this analysis, the article lays out 3 potential future trajectories for the industry, and labor seems to be the key variable swinging between them.
Absolutely. Labor stability or lack thereof is the pivot point.
Scenario 1, the most probable. What's that look like?
That's basically more of the same. Continued consolidation, maybe dropping us down to somewhere between 15,000 to 18,000 total operations nationally. Milk prices would likely remain relatively stable globally, but you'd see continued hollowing out of rural communities, fewer local suppliers, fewer buyers for used equipment. The landscape changes.
Okay. Scenario 2, the growing possibility. This one sounds different.
This one involves accelerated foreign investment. We're talking large Canadian processors, European food conglomerates, maybe even aggressive private equity firms, seeing an opportunity in distressed U.S. dairy assets.
So what happens then?
In this future, American dairy farming potentially becomes more like American dairy management. The original farm owners or families might transition into high-level employees managing a portfolio of large, efficient facilities owned by these outside entities. A fundamental shift in ownership structure.
Right. And then there's the third one, the high-impact outlier, the wild card scenario.
This is the one that hinges entirely on that labor crisis actually happening. This is what happens if there's coordinated, widespread federal immigration enforcement hitting dairy areas hard. It triggers the actual supply disruption we modeled earlier with Texas A&amp.
That's the $7 to $8 milk world.
That's the world where milk hits $7 to $8 a gallon, cheese and butter prices double or triple, grocery shelves have gaps, and the recovery requires maybe 5 to 10 years of fundamental industry restructuring, because you can't just instantly replace millions of lost cows and thousands of closed operations overnight. It takes years to rebuild that capacity.
Okay, let's pivot now to the political side of this, or maybe the lack of a political solution, because the legislative reaction to this pretty clear biological and economic fragility, it seems incredibly dysfunctional, doesn't it?
Dysfunctional is probably putting it mildly.
Yeah. We have these legislative proposals floating around, like the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, FWMA, and the Agricultural Reform Act. But looking closely, they don't actually seem to solve the core labor dependency problem for dairy, do they?
No, not even close. Let's just look at the basic math problem with FWMA, for example. It proposes 20,000 year-round agricultural visas annually, total, across all of ag. Dairy might get maybe 10,000 of those slots, optimistically?
Okay, 10,000 visas. But we established earlier the industry currently employs approximately 77,000 immigrant workers, right? Most of whom are undocumented, but already highly trained and essential.
Exactly. So 10,000 new visas only addresses roughly 13% of the existing need. 13%. That's barely a drop in the bucket for stabilizing the current system, let alone allowing for any future growth or flexibility.
And the requirements in FWMA for the current workers to gain legal status, they seem really lengthy and impractical.
Oh, they are. Current experienced workers would need, 10 years of documented agricultural work history before they even become eligible for permanent residency. A decade?
Mm-hmm.
That timeline is just absurdly long. It offers basically no immediate incentive or stability for the existing critical workforce that's keeping farms running today.
Then you've got the other proposal, Representative Van Orden's Agricultural Reform Act. That one sounds riddled with eligibility problems, too.
Yeah, it's got major hurdles. Current workers would supposedly need to leave the country and then return legally, paying a minimum fee of $2,500 per person. And get this, anyone who entered the U.S. during the current presidential administration wouldn't qualify at all, just arbitrarily excluded.
So you're creating layers upon layers of bureaucratic hurdles, financial barriers. It just sounds fundamentally unworkable for the actual existing labor force you're trying to stabilize.
It's completely unworkable. And the reality is, both of these proposals are basically stuck in committee anyway, as of late 2025 when this analysis was done, which means dairy still remains excluded from any kind of functional year-round access comparable to the H-2A program other ag sectors use, forcing continued reliance on the vulnerable, undocumented system.
Which raises a really important contrarian point the article makes. Why is the U.S. system so uniquely dysfunctional on this when our neighbor to the north seems to have figured it out? We should be using Canada's Temporary Foreign Worker Program, TFWP, as the functional comparison, shouldn't we?
Absolutely. Canada's TFWP program has been successfully adapting, but running for over 50 years. They allow over 60,000 TFWs annually across various sectors, including agriculture. Crucially, they have streams that allow for year-round access, and the work permit durations can go up to 24 months, sometimes longer.
So that stability allows Canadian producers to actually plan to retain trained staff.
Exactly. It insulates them to a large degree from the kind of sudden political enforcement shocks that U.S. dairy farmers live in constant fear of. The U.S. system's complete failure to create a viable, predictable, year-round program specifically for dairy's needs. It really feels like an intentional, self-inflicted wound at this point.
And the human element of all this legislative uncertainty, it circles right back to the farm stability, doesn't it? This source mentioned that detail about workers in Vermont delaying crucial prenatal care for months because they were afraid of enforcement actions.
Yeah, that single detail. Delaying critical health care for an unborn child. It just shows how the human cost spirals back and directly hits the operation's stability and productivity. It's impossible to run a stable, efficient farm if your key staff are operating in perpetual fear and potentially compromising their health.
But it's not all doom and gloom. We are seeing some really interesting regional adaptations, aren't we? Examples that offer genuine paths forward, proving some farms are tackling this proactively.
Definitely. Look at Central New York. Producers there, working closely with Cornell Cooperative Extension, they've developed some really innovative, sophisticated training programs for domestic workers.
And they're backing it up with real commitment.
Yeah, they're offering competitive salaries, the article mentioned, figures around $65,000 annually, plus benefits tied to 5-year contracts. And apparently they're successfully retaining these domestic workers well beyond that typical 2-year churn we see elsewhere. It can be done, but it requires serious investment and a different management approach.
That's a huge commitment, $65,000 plus benefits in a 5-year deal. But maybe that's what it takes, an investment in stability.
It might be. And we're seeing other structural changes trying to address that lifestyle challenge we talked about. Some Wisconsin cooperatives are apparently exploring rotating labor pools between member farms.
How would that work?
The idea is to allow workers to have scheduled weekends off, maybe rotating holidays. That's a key requirement for retaining domestic workers long term. The coordination is obviously complex, but the operations experimenting with it report massive gains in workforce stability and morale.
Interesting. And maybe the easiest change, the one with the highest immediate ROI, housing.
Absolutely. This comes up again and again. It's almost industry best practice now. Operations that invest in providing actual quality housing, think decent apartments, maybe small houses, separate from the farm itself, not just crowded communal dormitories, they're seeing turnover rates drop dramatically, often from like 45% annually down to maybe 15%.
Treat your workers with dignity, provide decent living conditions regardless of their origin.
And it generates measurable financial and operational returns. Fewer mistakes, better animal care, lower training costs. It just makes business sense.
We're also seeing that strategic relocation trend, right? Producers voting with their feet.
Yep. The source notes California producers facing increasingly prohibitive state regulations and costs are literally picking up and relocating entire operations to states with more favorable regulatory environments, like Texas or South Dakota. Strategic location is becoming just as critical as feed costs or genetics when you're calculating long-term viability. You have to factor in the political and regulatory risk now. Hashtag tag 3 actionable insights segment.
All right, expert speaker, let's bring this home. Farmer just finished morning milking. Maybe they're driving to the feed store right now, listening to this, thinking about this incredibly volatile reality we've just laid out. What are the 3 most actionable things they absolutely need to take away from this deep dive?
Okay, 3 key things. First, immediate action, something you need to look at, like this week. Assess your labor vulnerability and compliance. Seriously.
What does that mean practically?
For farms of all scales, you absolutely must prioritize professional HR infrastructure, get documented hiring protocols in place, have robust compliance programs, maybe even get an external audit. If you're operating over, say, 2,500 cows, you need to be actively diversifying your labor strategies right now, maybe exploring those cooperative pool models we mentioned, looking at different visa options if possible. The system is just too fragile for complacency. Know your weak points.
Okay, that's immediate. What about medium-term strategy? Thinking ahead, like the next 3 to 6 months.
Medium term, it really feels like decision time, and it's largely based on your current scale. Determine your exit or expansion strategy based on scale.
Break that down.
If you're currently running an operation under 500 cows, you need to be seriously exploring niche markets right now. Things like certified organic, 100% grass-fed, maybe specialized genetics like A2A2, that can command significant premiums. We're talking $3 to $10 per hundredweight, maybe more, just to overcome that structural 10-to-1 GOD cost gap compared to the big guys. Relying solely on commodity prices at that scale, the math suggests it's just no longer viable long-term.
Okay, that's sub 500. What about the middle group?
If you're in that 500 to 1,500 cow range, you are caught squarely in that consolidation squeeze. You need a defined plan, and soon. You either need to be actively planning for significant expansion, getting up over that 2,500 cow threshold, which means securing millions in capital, planning infrastructure, or you need to be strategically seeking partnerships, maybe merging with neighbors, or looking at contract production relationships with larger entities. The data is absolutely clear. Just standing still in that middle-sized category, hoping things get better, that's not a viable long-term strategy in this volatile market. You have to choose a direction.
Right. Okay, immediate assessment. Medium-term strategic decision. What about long-term positioning, thinking 1 to 2 years out?
Long-term, it comes down to 2 key investments. Invest in your workers and your strategic location.
We talked about workers.
You absolutely must invest in quality worker housing if you haven't already. It's probably the single best investment you can make to reduce that crippling high turnover. It pays for itself tenfold in reduced training costs, fewer mistakes, and improved herd health and stability. Treat people well.
And location.
And if you are considering building a new facility or doing a major renovation, you have to carefully assess your state-level regulatory trajectory and the political stability around ag labor in that state. Look hard at why those California producers are moving to Texas and South Dakota, and critically, learn from that Kansas example. Do not repeat that retrofitting mistake. Invest properly up front in things like good barn design and cow traffic flow to avoid those catastrophic milk losses later. Location and smart infrastructure are key for the long haul. Hashtag Tad Shambuffet. Enhanced show outro.
Well, this has been another pretty essential deep dive from the Bullvine Podcast, I think. If this kind of operational and economic analysis helps your operation really understand the labor, the biological, and the economic realities you're facing, well, head over to www.thebullvine.com. There are more detailed articles there that really tell you what's actually happening in dairy beyond the headlines.
And seriously, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We are absolutely dedicated to tracking these kinds of existential threats and opportunities for the industry. Remember that American demand for dairy products, it remains incredibly strong, something like 650 pounds per person annually. But if that labor crisis really hits and milk prices fundamentally change that consumer base, pushing fluid milk up towards that $7 or $8 per gallon mark, well, dairy risks becoming a luxury item for many, and that could accelerate a forced shift to alternatives unlike anything we've seen. Somebody, somewhere, is going to produce that milk globally. The real question for you listening is, which operations here will survive, adapt, and be positioned to provide it? We'll keep tracking those stalled legislative efforts and the regional adaptations we discussed today. Thanks for tuning in.